Jack the Ripper's 1888 murders caused a near hysteria, not just in London, where they happened, but all over the world. There were false sightings of him in Europe, in the United States, and even down in South America. But while many were terrified of him, some blamed the London police. The New York chief of detectives, Thomas Byrnes, criticized the London police for failing to capture Jack the Ripper, saying that if he had been in New York, he would have been in the clink in 24 hours. Well, not long after, Byrnes received a letter that was purportedly from Jack himself, who said that New York was his next target. In 1891, a woman named Carrie Brown, who was a prostitute nicknamed Old Shakespeare for her frequent quoting of the bard, was found brutally murdered in a seedy hotel along the waterfront in Manhattan. This scene recalled for the press and police alike Jack the Ripper's victims in London. Panicked New Yorkers worked feverishly to halt the maniac's spree. A frenzy broke out, not too dissimilar from what happened on the west coast of the United States after the Pearl Harbor bombings that led to the internment of Japanese Americans. The NYPD finally arrested Amir Ben Ali, an Algerian immigrant who was staying at a nearby hotel room, but the newspapers quickly criticized Byrnes for moving too quickly, thinking that they were just trying to pin blame on him and save face. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, but the French consulate appealed the decision, and after 10 years, Ben Ali was finally pardoned and won his release when new evidence was produced. So if Ben Ali was innocent, who was the real killer? Today we're joined by Luke Jerod Kummer, who is the author of the new audiobook Takers Mad. It's a historical narrative look at one of the most notorious crimes of the Gilded Age. In his reimagining of this story, the murder is investigated by Flora, who's daughter-in-law of Jacob Riis, a real-life muckraking journalist who wrote the famous book The Lives of Others. And the book explores whether the police scapegoated the man arrested for the crime, or whether authorities actually let Jack the Ripper walk free. This is a late 19th century true crime story and shows some of the seedier sides of the Gilded Age. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Luke Jerod Kummer. Your story takes place during moral panic in 1891, following the murders of Jack the Ripper, and at the time, people are probably seeing Jack the Ripper behind every rock and inflating the prospects of danger far beyond the actual risk. He wouldn't go across the Atlantic. And this atmosphere reminds me of the days and weeks and months following 9/11, when everyone was on edge about terrorist attacks and really inflating it beyond all reasonable measure. For example, a mall security cop in Cleveland, Ohio might implement tighter measures to prevent Al-Qaeda from attacking the food court there, when that's probably not the highest list of terrorist attacks. But less humorously, there was a panic in California following the Pearl Harbor bombings that led to the internment of Japanese Americans. So could you describe this climate of moral panic following the Jack the Ripper attacks, whether in New York or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. I think that the similarity is one of is a case of media innovation and the sort of repetition of an image. In the case of 9/11, we all saw those planes crash into the buildings over and over and over again. And I guess you can say that there's sort of antecedents to that previously. I guess the hostage crisis in Tehran decades earlier, or these other events where we just see it over and over again, and it becomes so much part of our consciousness. But I think that in some ways, while the threat was perhaps even less in the case of Jack the Ripper than in some sort of terrorist event inspired by 9/11 or related to 9/11, I think that in some ways, because that kind of media distribution was so new at the time of the murders in Whitechapel, the sort of, as you say, hysteria or paranoia maybe was even, I guess it's hard to quantify, but greater in some ways, because this was really the first sort of media event that had reached this scale. And to sort of put our minds back at that time, a lot of this sort of mass media was really new at the time. So if you think about it, the telegraph itself, it only sort of arrived in the 1850s. And this was around the same time as the sort of new invention of syndication. It's, I guess, an economic invention, you'd think, where you have the Associated Press and Reuters and AFP are suddenly distributing news all around. And I think that confluence really changes things. I also think you could say that there's other sort of contemporaneous things going on, such as a rise in literacy rates, where there's more ability for a wider breadth of the public to be readers. I think that you also have the price of newspapers dropped a lot due to both business reasons. Charles Dana in New York had innovated sort of the penny press in New York, but also in UK, you have the sort of penny dreadfuls, which are fictional, but related to the same sort of phenomenon of printing costs going down because of the rotary press, and paper costs going down because of the switch from rag paper to wood pulp paper. And you have this thing where all of a sudden you have the masses are able to read, and there's a market for this, and you have the publishers eager to capture this market. So you have this proliferation of newspapers, and also, as I say, with the penny dreadfuls, these sort of dramas. And I think that there's sometimes a merging of content there, where you have the newspapers emulating the sort of fictional penny dreadfuls, which were these sort of sensational, often very gory, fictionalized accounts. So in comes this sensational event, just by nature it's sensational, in that you have this series of murders in Whitechapel, an area of London's East End, in 1888. And the way that the news trickles out sort of leads to this phenomenon in that it's very difficult for Scotland Yard to identify a suspect. Nobody's caught. And there's new murders that are linked to what becomes this emergent sort of idea of a serial killer. And that term wasn't used at the time, but this serial killer, and the details just keep coming. The murders keep coming, and it really has everyone an edge. That event now, because of the other things I mentioned, the news syndication, the higher readership in London, is able to be transmitted to more people in England. But then also it becomes this worldwide phenomenon where you have people who are able to read about it, not only in Europe, but also in Asia, in South America, in North America, very much in the United States. And so it becomes this worldwide event in a way that just wasn't technologically possible in previous times. So it very much had the New York public wrapped, and there was a real fear that this culprit, who was never caught, or no one was ever sort of credibly accused, this culprit was going to escape from London to come to New York. It's worth noting that at around the same time, the steamship, the transatlantic steamship, had come into its own. It obviously was innovated previously, but it was still sort of inspiring people's imagination because it wasn't a part of everyone's life yet. But this idea of this ease of travel from London to New York, where quickly someone who was trying to flee a crime like this could, in just days, arrive in New York and begin this sort of campaign of terror, or spread this campaign of terror. That wasn't just in New York. If you look back at the accounts from the era, you also have people in these far-flung places saying that they had sightings of Jack the Ripper in Jamaica, in South Africa. All over the world, there's these supposed sightings of Jack the Ripper, and it becomes this sort of bigger-than-life villain, this sort of super villain that just was obviously, as you said initially, a phenomenon beyond what was reasonable, to the level of hysteria and paranoia.
This sets the stage for the setting of your audiobook, and you dramatize real murder that happened, where a woman is found dead in a seedy hotel along the waterfront of Manhattan. How did you find out about this story originally, and what evidence did you dig up concerning it?
Well, initially, I was just looking to tell a good story. Quite honestly, I had written a biographical novel previously that was set around the same time. It's the Blue Period. It was about the early life of Pablo Picasso. It's set around the same time period. I just kind of fell in love with that era. And then I wanted to do another story that was just set in that era, but closer to home. That was set in Spain and France, and I wanted to do something in the States. And so I was looking for a good story, and I just stumbled on this, by reading about that time period. And so I began writing it, and I had interest from Audible in telling the story. But then as I started to do the research, I ended up finding this new evidence in the case. And that just wasn't something I expected. Initially, I had the great aid of a researcher, a prominent scholar, Linda K. Jacobs, who's done a lot of work in the sort of early what was known as Syrian colony in New York, early study of the Arabic community that emerged in the United States. And she was kind enough to turn me on to a number of documents. One of them is that she pointed to the library at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where they had on microfilm the trial transcripts of this case. She was familiar with Amir Ben Ali when I mentioned it to her, and she pointed me there. And so I went there and I digitized 1,100, almost 1,200 pages of trial transcripts and went through them. And I found all these things in the trial transcripts that really were not reported at the time. And it appeared that the research that was out there oftentimes really was not giving consideration of these trial transcripts. And so it was largely based on the newspaper reporting at the time. And that can be really problematic because it is, of course, only a first draft of history that then kind of gets cemented to then be seen as fact. But if you start wading through these 1,200 pages of trial transcripts, a very different story emerges. And you can call into all these things into question today with the knowledge that we have now that wasn't available to reporters at the time who were covering that case. So that was a big moment. And then from there, I contacted the New York State Archives. There's this rule. I guess I should back up for a moment to say that there was this murder, and then this man, Amir Ben Ali, was convicted of the murder and later exonerated. And so I knew that he'd been applying for clemency for years via his lawyers. And there's this rule in New York State that any correspondence with the governor has to be preserved. And so I contacted the New York State Archives, and it turned out they had some of the files related to this case where Amir Ben Ali and his lawyers were applying for clemency through the administrations of several governors. And so on a cold, wintry day in early 2020, I took a bus up to Albany, and I got there, and the librarian showed me 4 boxes that he'd hauled out of storage. And I started going through all these archives related to the case that had been preserved.
It's very interesting to look at it because it's both a murder case, but then also a psychological profile of how the city is responding to something that seems quaint from our vantage point, but could have been terrifying then. So first of all, can you tell me the facts that were known about the murder, and was it immediately a media sensation?
Sure. So on the morning of April 24th, 1891, a woman was found dead inside a locked hotel room of this seedy hotel near Manhattan's waterfront. And without going into all the gory details, she had been badly cut up. She had been eviscerated. There was a lot of blood, and it was a horrible scene. And as you say, this came only a few years after the so-called Autumn of Terror in London. And so the next day, New York's coroner, Schultze, he declared that Jack the Ripper had crossed the Atlantic and come to America. And so the papers in New York, many of which had a sort of a sensationalist bent to begin with, that of Pulitzer, Hearst, etc., who were competing savagely to increase their circulations. They splashed this story on the front page and then ran with it for days. It just kept expanding. It created this panic that we've talked about in the city, and there's tremendous pressure to catch a suspect. The person in charge of the detective bureau at the time was a man named Tom Byrnes. He was sort of a bigger-than-life personality himself, which we could talk about if you'd like. And he launches this manhunt across New York that extends also to New Jersey, that extends to Washington, D.C., that extends to Chicago, that extends to other countries. They were, in contact with Scotland Yard. And that panic that was created only finally ends when, after a number of leads had fallen through, the police abruptly charged this immigrant, an Algerian man who didn't speak English, with the crime. Amir Ben Ali is the man's name. And that's the history I wrote about. As I say, later on, it was new facts emerged in the case, and he was exonerated, Ben Ali.
Why was he originally charged for the murder?
So the room where the woman was found was in room 31 at the East River Hotel. And Amir Ben Ali had stayed at room 33 in the hotel. And during the investigation, the police hauled in a bunch of people. It was, dozens of people in a dragnet. And they used the ability to hold a material witness. So this is not necessarily someone who's suspected of the crime, but they're a material witness. It's a statute that's been controversial for a long time. The New York State Legislature enacted restraints shortly before this, but under these unusual circumstances, Tom Byrnes was able to hold a lot of people in the tombs as material witnesses. And Amir Ben Ali was among many. And as I say, there was a bunch of people who were also holding as suspects. As those suspects fell through, then eventually they decided to charge Amir Ben Ali, who was known in the press as Frenchie, until another foreigner was also held, who became known as Frenchie number 2. And they decided to charge Amir Ben Ali with the crime. There was some sort of circumstantial evidence beyond this, and then what was later presented in court as physical evidence. But the defense attorneys at the time, who didn't have a lot of resources, they presented some fairly compelling evidence of their own, or sort of contradictions of their own, that question whether the physical evidence should have been entered at all. So, for example, the prosecution said that Amir Ben Ali had been found with blood on his shirt. Yes, it was, but it was a very small amount of blood on the front flap of his shirt and on the back of his shirt. And he had an explanation for why it was there. This murder, remember, was a person being eviscerated. There was a lot of blood. And so the idea that Amir Ben Ali, who was found with small amounts of blood on the front flap of his shirt, was guilty of a crime such as this, it drew questions at the time. There also, during the courtroom proceedings, it was said that there was a blood trail from room 31 to room 33. But the crime scene at the time had not been sealed. And so, as there was affidavits later on that from reporters who were there the beginning of the case, as they testified, there was no blood trail originally, but then because the crime scene had not been sealed, as was the practice of the day, the police and dozens of reporters and even onlookers, because again this case was attracting tremendous attention, so you had these curious onlookers who were coming to the murder scene. So after a while, of course, there was blood all over the floor because there was a ton of blood in the room, but that initially was not there. So there were enough things that they were able to build a case, and that's what they did. And they sent away Amir Ben Ali to prison. Initially, they were trying to get first-degree murder, but they were not able to get a unanimous jury to go for that. So they did get a second-degree murder conviction, which was good for Ben Ali because the first-degree conviction would have led to the electric chair. But with that second-degree conviction, he was sentenced to life, and he was sent to Sing Sing. Later on, he was said to have a sort of breakdown of sorts, and then he was transferred to an asylum. In 1901, someone came forward with a piece of evidence that showed that it was virtually impossible for Amir Ben Ali to have committed the crime, and he was freed. So now, as a researcher, as I look back at all the evidence that was presented at the trial and all of the very sensational, oftentimes very, very, disturbingly prejudiced reporting from newspapers at the time, it all shows how a case was built against this person using both circumstantial evidence, witnesses who probably were not telling the truth, and these sort of quasi-scientific analysis of physical evidence to build this case and secure a conviction, which, of course, now we know was unjust.
This is an interesting point about the evolution of forensic science, because on the one hand, they didn't have the benefit at the end of the 19th century of fingerprints, if the firearm were used, ballistics, and other things that make it easier to build a case against a suspect. On the other hand, there are timeless hallmarks of the justice system that we're still dealing with today, of prejudice by prosecutors or police officers, jury members. How would you characterize this case? Was it typical of the day? Was there a particular prejudice? Was the city or Tom Byrnes simply desperate to find a suspect and nail the crime on someone? How would you characterize it? Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors. But first, I want to give a shout out to all the great shows on the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Key Battles of American History. You can find this show and many other great ones like it by going to parthenonpodcast.com.
I think it's a lot of those things. I will say, and maybe this is sort of not getting at the heart of it, but getting to the periphery. But I will say that those prejudices at the time were somewhat different than today. And they're sometimes surprising, but they still worked against Amir Ben Ali. So Amir Ben Ali, he had been a soldier, an Algerian-born person who, at the time, Algeria had become a colony of France, and so he was technically a French citizen. And so he had served in a so-called Turcos regiment. This is a group of sort of indigenous Algerians who were working under the auspices of the French military to quell unrest in Algeria. And then in 1870, when France is fighting Germany, these Turcos are called into service, and Amir Ben Ali and, well, his regiment anyway, apparently served very valiantly in the defense of a fort in Alsace and Lorraine as Germany was trying to take this territory. The reason why I bring this up is it was noted by a few publications that were somewhat more sympathetic to Ben Ali's plight that the jury of that courtroom was composed mostly of German Americans. A short time after Amir Ben Ali, relatively short time after Amir Ben Ali had served in the French army fighting the Germans. So what that New York Sun, it happened to be, article was suggesting was that there was prejudice against Amir Ben Ali, not just because he was Arab or Muslim, and there's ample, clear prejudice against him that is visible in the court documents and the newspaper archives at the time about that, but there's also prejudice against him because he had fought with the French against the Germans, and that did not benefit him with a mostly, according to the Sun, German-American jury. So I think that prejudice was and is today a big factor, but also I should say that, of course, prejudices change over the times. There was a big manhunt initially, not for someone who was sort of dark-complected or darker complected like Amir Ben Ali, but for a German-speaking suspect. And it's worth noting that there was a ton of prejudice during that era or slightly before against Germans, which, might be easily forgotten today as prejudices have shifted, but you have to, I think, as a person looking at history, try to recreate the sort of ignorances and prejudices and contexts of the time. I do think there was also, to answer your other question about Tom Byrnes, there was a tremendous amount of pressure for him to solve this crime. He had made perhaps an unfortunate boast in a interview during around the time of the 1888 Whitechapel killings. He had said to a reporter that if anyone who emulated this sort of Jack the Ripper character in Tom Byrnes' jurisdiction in New York, he'd have the person in prison in a short time. The quote is often quoted as in the clink in 3 days, or in the clink in 24 hours, or in the jug in 24 hours. It varies how it's re-quoted, but in a short time. And so there is a lot of pressure now because of such a dramatic story of, okay, will Tom Byrnes be able to fulfill his boast or not? And I think that there's also a lot of pressure on him to quell the kind of hysteria you're talking about. And that was a real concern. I always like to bring up that, during the killings in London, there was apparently almost pogroms against Jews because it was thought for a while that a Jewish person had committed this crime in London. And so there was all of a sudden prejudice turned against Jews. In a similar vein, if you can imagine yourself in Tom Byrnes' shoes in New York, if you have growing mass hysteria, you don't know where that's going to turn. And I think that it was understandable for him to want to lock this down and get a suspect, get a person in custody, and then ultimately win a conviction. That's the job of the police. Except for the means to that end that he used, I don't think that when we look back today are either justifiable or just.
Right. There's a lot of challenges here. Criminal science is very much in its infancy, and I recommend to listeners a companion episode to this about Edward Oscar Heinrich called the American Sherlock, who developed a lot of the forensic science in the United States in the 1930s, and you can look for that in the archives. in the 1890s, there was a lot of pseudoscience about criminal psychology that a killer has this type of mold and they fit these characteristics. And it makes it easy to slot in different prejudices. That's always easy for people to do. But at that time, science validated it in a certain type of way. There are a number of issues here of nationality, one could say race. There's also a class element here, and you bring in somebody who was involved in this particular case, Jacob Riis, who is a muckraking journalist, and that is an entry point for your fictionalized account of his daughter-in-law, Flora Riis, who's an aspiring pulp novelist herself. But tell me about Jacob Riis. He wrote The Lives of Others, who he was in the late 20th or in the late 19th century, and what he observed about this case.
Sure. He had written also How the Other Half Lives, Battle of the Slums. He was a crusader. He was a muckraking journalist who was an immigrant himself. He had emigrated from Denmark, and he describes experiencing a lot of prejudice when he arrived here. He didn't speak the language, and so to me, there was some sort of at least way that he could identify with Amir Ben Ali. As it so happened, he was involved in this case, and that he was one of the first reporters on the scene. He was a reporter covering the police headquarters, and so when this murder happened, he was one of the first reporters on the scene. And so he is one of the reporters who, years later, he said that there was no blood trail. I found one of those affidavits in the New York State Historical Archives, where he is testifying that he found no blood trail at the time, and one must have emerged only later. So it so happens that his daughter-in-law, a real-life person, Florence Malasso Riis, who is married to Eddie, his son, who became a city editor at the Brooklyn Eagle, she was an early pulp fiction writer. She had some success in a sector of the publishing industry where women were not only allowed to write, but actually had some prominence, had in some cases more ability than men. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to tell the story. Found that surely she would have talked to her father-in-law, who had played this integral role in the case, being one of the people who helped free Amir Ben Ali. So that's why I included her. I will say, to respond otherwise about the sort of class dynamic, it's worth noting that Jacob Riis wasn't always sympathetic to every group of immigrants. If you reread today How the Other Half Lives, it's sometimes troubling the way that he characterized different groups in New York. And I get into that a little bit in Taker's Mad. So in these archives, in these 4 boxes, I found all these letters from Amir Ben Ali, and I found these affidavits, and I found these correspondences between the lawyers. But then I also found in this envelope this key. I opened up this thing, and there's this small metal object, and it is the key to that locked room, the locked hotel room that disappeared in 1891. And during the investigation, it was always suspected that the murderer had this key, but that key was never found. And then in 1901, somebody mysteriously turns in that missing key after withholding this for years and years and years. And I found other documents in these archives that explain some of the circumstances of how that happened, and that I now would sort of, looking back at this, call into question how it was allowed that this person who withheld this key for all this time was able to sort of skate by without more scrutiny being applied to it.
What do you make of all this? He's eventually exonerated. How does this come about? And in light of this evidence that you found, what do you think this adds to the story?
He's ultimately exonerated because this key is turned in by this person who is originally presented as an anonymous source. And it was pretty remarkable looking back at the newspaper clippings to see how he was characterized. I think that the New York World was so kind that they called him a person of mercantile prominence who asked that his name be withheld, or something along these lines, which is incredibly generous terms for this sensational paper that had just put Amir Ben Ali, for example, through the ringer. And this person turns this key after withholding this evidence that would have freed Amir Ben Ali for years earlier, and then is able to obtain anonymity from the court system and from the newspapers. And as I'm digging through these archives, I found out some of the reason why this might have been, in that there was also a separate letter from Governor Voorhees, the governor of New Jersey at the time, to Governor Odell, the governor of New York at the time. And Governor Voorhees said that this person, whose name is George Damon, was a close personal friend of him, of Governor Voorhees. And he was a respected member of the community. And so, he should be trusted. And what that helped do was establish among the newspapers, I guess, that he shouldn't be named. I also think it's worth noting that he's characterized initially as a person of mercantile prominence. Well, that industry that he's involved in is that for more than several decades, he had been a manufacturer of printing presses and a letter type foundry, a couple blocks from Newspaper Row. And he also, it's worth noting, was, because he was granted this anonymity, able to disguise that his business in New York, despite him living in Cranford, New Jersey, which is a bedroom community of New York, his business in New York was less than a mile from the crime scene. And his alibi that is in his affidavit is, as we look back today, knowing the facts we know, incredibly weak. If we have time, I can review it with you, but it's incredibly weak. And it really caused me to question, well, what if George Damon had received the same scrutiny as Amir Ben Ali had, if he had not been able to leverage his connections with these people of political prominence and his sort of long-standing role in the printing industry and the publishing industry to remain anonymous and to avoid scrutiny. I think that there's today a real question of whether he should have been much more closely investigated.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Eventually, what are the theories that the press provides about this woman's murderer? Who do they think it was? Or do they just throw out their hands and say, well, it's unsolved?
Do you mean after the exoneration, or do you mean during the initial investigation?
Both.
During the initial investigation, it's interesting to look back at the newspapers from the time because there's tons and tons of coverage because, as I say, there was a huge interest in this case. And so there's all these different suspects brought in, and there's all these different turns. And with each one, the press breathlessly reports it, but then it's seemingly forgotten or not mentioned the following day when there's a new suspect that emerged. There's all these suspects because it was a dragnet. And then the sort of most of that dies down after Amir Ben Ali, a.k.a. Frenchie, is charged with the crime. There's a few sparse bits of reporting that continue to look at this case, but most of that dies down and we move to the trial phase. And then a publication like the New York World, they really characterized Amir Ben Ali in these terrible terms. They would call him a Mohammedan fatalist, a miserable Arab, a long lank child of the desert, long lank yellow child of the desert, I believe the quote is, in these terrible, terrible terms. And he was really portrayed as a sort of subhuman who had committed this horrendous crime. And, the press helped very much build the case in the public against him. But then after he was exonerated, they didn't exactly issue an apology, but some publications did note this and sort of reevaluate the case to an extent. But what didn't happen is they didn't revisit the case and try to find out who really was the culprit. And as I say, in my opinion, George Damon should have been much more closely scrutinized, but that didn't happen, as far as I can tell, and reading a lot of clippings for the time, didn't happen at all. George Damon was allowed to present this evidence. His story was taken for granted because of his position and his connections, and they went with it, that he somehow managed to withhold evidence without being charged with holding evidence, and he wasn't run through the ringer the way that he might have expected to be. The story he told was that in 1891, a short time before the murder, he had a problem on his property in Cranford, New Jersey. He needed some repairs done. So he went to New York, to Castle Garden, and he hired the equivalent of a day laborer. And he brought this person to his property in Cranford, New Jersey. And then this person disappeared one night and came home very late. and he was in a bad state, and he presumably passed out in the barn where he was staying. And then a few days later, he vanished completely. It's worth noting that this person, to George Damon's recollection, was apparently a Dane or a Swede, according to him. And following this, the maid, a servant, she apparently finds that the Dane or Swede farmhand had left behind a key and a bloody set of clothes. And so she turns this into her employer, George Damon, and he decides that he doesn't want to face the sort of publicity of that this might entail. And so he's going to keep the key to himself. What he does do is, which is strange to me, and this is in the affidavit, is he says that he went with another person to the East River Hotel where the murder had occurred because he'd heard of this story, he says. And he went there with an employee, a person who is listed in the affidavit as a truckman, someone who drove his trucks. And they went to the hotel and they had a cigar and they had a beer and they waited around, and eventually someone brought down a set of the keys, and George Damon, using his expertise in type foundry, was able to determine, apparently, that the print of the room number on the keys at the East River Hotel was identical, he says, to the key now in his possession that had been left behind by the supposed Dane. And so he understood the implications, he says, and then he decided that he didn't want to bring the publicity of this case onto him or his family or his business. And he also claims to have feared that perhaps this killer would return and harm somebody. And so him and his wife, they say that they put this key in a safe and then forgot about it for a decade. I find that all very problematic because it's in this affidavit, and then there's a few other affidavits, such as that truckman. He submits an affidavit to say this is what he recalls. And then there's this other person who is also a contractor in New Jersey who apparently was professionally related to George Damon, who submits an affidavit saying that George Damon told him about the story. And then he also said that for your safety, don't tell anyone else. But that's all that is submitted in these affidavits as way of an alibi. But if you think about it, it's not really an alibi, because in no form does it say where George Damon was that night. And in no way does it actually prove that there even was this supposed Dane or Swedish farmhand. Because he waited for so long, there's no account of that person at all. That person could be made up. And then you wonder, okay, well, what did the maid say? Where's the interview with this maid who found a set of bloody clothes and this key? Well, because they waited for so long, that maid was long gone. There's a couple of researchers out of Pennsylvania, I believe, Howe Brown and Nita Brown, and they've looked at this case, and they were able to recently come up with, via census data, the different maids who served in the Damon household. And that maid was long gone because he waited 10 plus years to reveal this evidence. So we don't have any testimony that actually lays for fact that this person existed. There's also no affidavit from George Damon's wife, who apparently also knew about this key, to corroborate his story. There's nothing. And yet somehow he was able to avoid scrutiny, the kind of scrutiny that was heaped upon Amir Ben Ali, but somehow George Damon, he just skates by, because after all, he's a person of mercantile prominence, as he was identified in the papers.
As an epilogue, what happens to the different people, Amir Ben Ali, George Damon, and others? And are there any long-term effects that this murder has, whether legally, on New York society, or something else?
George Damon, he passes away a few years later. He apparently had been suffering from Bright's disease, which we would think of as sort of kidney failure, for a while. He dies in 1906. It's my speculation that he might have wanted to get something off of his chest before he became increasingly ill. His wife, Ann Damon, she remained a person of prominence in Cranford. She was a member of a lot of community organizations at the time. Amir Ben Ali, after he's freed by an act of clemency by New York's Governor Odell in 1902, part of the arrangement, because he, after all, had been committed to an insane asylum, he was put directly on a passenger ship to France, and then presumably sailed onward to Algeria, where he was presumably reunited with his family. But nobody hears from him again. In terms of a matter of the impact of this case, that we can see a lasting legacy, I mean, I think that in some circles, this set a pattern for, okay, here's a person that was wrongfully put through this system. If we want, we could imagine that this has a fruition in today's things like the Innocence Project and the Innocent Network, where you establish this community effort to try to free somebody who had been wrongfully accused. When I was going through those archives in Albany, also there was just reams and reams of petitions from these concerned New Yorkers who saw the injustice here. And I thought that was kind of the sort of silver lining of the story, in that I think that the things that happened to Amir Ben Ali and the way that he was characterized and the way he was imprisoned wrongfully for a matter of time is heartbreaking. I read his letters that talked about the mistreatment he received, but also that idea that the community did come out for him and did continue to offer petitions and did continue to push for this. And there was lawyers working on his behalf all the time for clemency. That was more encouraging. I think that you can see similar actions today via the Innocence Project, the Innocence Network, and other organizations working to free people that have gotten caught up by the system, perhaps during a period of hysteria, as you say, and then held for these long periods wrongfully.
In addition to this legacy, is there anything else that you would like listeners to take away from your fictionalized narrative recounting of this murder?
I mean, the reason why I write about history in general is because I want people to look back at that history and be interested in it so they can understand the context of the time. But then also it allows us because of the distance, I think it allows us a new vantage to view our own times. And so when I see things at that time, like the use of material witnesses, where these people were just rounded up, oftentimes from sort of the most marginalized parts of society, and held in the tombs until they could secure their freedom by providing the testimony that would put someone else behind bars for a long time. You can see similar things today. In the material witness issue specifically, this came up after 9/11. There was court cases. There's a famous lawsuit against John Ashcroft, where a football player at the University of Idaho, he was held as a material witness for weeks in a form of detention for months, not because he was accused of a crime, not because he was suspected of a crime, but because he was a material witness. That is something that endures in our legal system. That is one of the many troubling aspects of this 19th century case, where I found it problematic at the time, but I knew that there was the ignorances and prejudices and problems of the times. But then as I continued to do research about the current day, I realized many of those things still exist today. So I tried to tell a story that would dramatize this, but also, inspire people to look back at then, but also look at now.
Well, there's much more to this story. It's also wrapped up in a great story, plus lots of great voice acting, which if listeners want to check out, they can listen to Luke's audiobook, Takers Mad, which is available on Audio. Luke, thank you for joining us.
And thank you, Scott. I appreciate it.
All right, that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to see show notes for this and all my other episodes and include sources, maps, or other relevant information, go to parthenonpodcast.com. Parthenon is the name of the podcast network that History Unplugged is a part of, along with other great history shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, there are two easy ways to do so. The first is to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. This really helps the show grow. The second thing is to join our membership program on Patreon. And if you do so, you can get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog of the show, which is 600 episodes and growing,